So I said I was going to make a video on this topic, which is my thoughts on hyperbloom teams. And more specifically, should you use Raiden Shogun or should you use Kuki Shinobu? So there's some gameplay in the background. Firstly, Raiden's faster hits are basically a placebo. It doesn't really matter as much as some people think it does. This whole idea that Raiden's electro hits every 0.9 seconds and Shinobu's electro hits every 1.5 seconds, so that's way more hyperblooms. I think I've seen going around that makes Raiden do 30% or 50% more damage. It doesn't really seem to work that way in practice. Also, the theoretical DPS calculations that people use, they don't really matter either. And if you don't want to use my gameplay for any reason, there's a lot of other YouTubers who have also done boss comparisons and the results are fairly similar to mine. There's basically no difference, at least DPS wise, against a practice dummy. Now, what actually does matter is the practical differences. And it's not only that Shinobu is a healer, although that is a deal breaker for like 9 out of 10 players, which is why they will always play her. But there are also other differences. Some you think might give Raiden the advantage and others which can give Shinobu the advantage. And we can take a look at all the ones I can think of. Speaking of healing, the first category is defensive utility. Now obviously Raiden doesn't heal and Shinobu does heal, so that's very useful role compression for majority of players. Most people won't be playing this game without at least a shielder or a healer, and Shinobu does that. Now Shinobu's healing is far from perfect, but I'll speak more on that in another section. But there's also a different area of defensive utility I thought of, which is that with Raiden you can play more from range, whereas Shinobu, her electric circle is around the player model, which means you have to be closer to enemies and the dendro cores at all times. Now having said that, if you do play Raiden from range, that will negate the hydro application of Xingqiu's orbitals, but it is interesting. The next section will be offensive utility. Now, as many people know, Dragon's Bane, because it has low base attack, it has basically the maximum amount of EM you can get for a 4-star. And Shinobu's 4-star weapons, by comparison, she doesn't have that low base attack high EM weapon, so her 4-star weapons will have less EM. Now obviously when you compare this would mean Raiden has more overall EM, which means she'll have more overall damage, at least when you're comparing these weapons. Raiden also gives an elemental burst buff for her teammates, and most notably in these kinds of teams that would be a good buff for Xingqiu or Yelan, but it wouldn't be that useful for teammates like Fischl, Nahida or Kazuha. So although Shinobu's 4-star weapons would have less EM than Dragon's Bane, compared to Raiden she does have access to lots of support weapons, like the Key, like Freedom Sworn, like Xiphos. Now obviously these weapons could be a lot more rarer, but this is very interesting. For example, if you played Fischl instead of Yelan, which is another popular team, Freedom Sworn giving 20% attack to both Xingqiu and Fischl would be pretty big. And in comparison, like I said, Raiden's burst buff here would be less relevant to Fischl. And you can also use Xiphos, which gives ER to the whole team. Now obviously in these videos, this is one rotation, so it doesn't showcase the benefits of ER, but if you had refines on your Xiphos, you could probably argue that the ER to Xingqiu or Yelan could be just as useful as Raiden's burst buff to Xingqiu or Yelan, because if you need less ER, you can then put more damaging stats on them. Also, if you play the hyperbloom team with raw EM scaling characters like Al Haytham or Nahida, you know, it's not just their reactions, but their talents scale off EM. Nilu's signature weapon will give a lot of EM share, so that could be also useful. Actually, speaking of the key, a lot of people think that because Raiden has Dragon's Bane, she is always going to have more EM than Shinobu. If you have the key and a bit of HP substats, once you get all the stacks here, Shinobu's EM can actually be slightly higher than Raiden's. You can see mine here, for example. And then as mentioned, on top of this, you'll be giving a lot of EM buffs to the team. If you're worried about the key stacks taking a long time, it's not a problem if you have Shinobu at C4 because you can stack it very quickly. Speaking of a C4, Shinobu does have a few more offensive utilities. This extra electro application not only helps with key stacks, but it also could get a few extra hyperblooms. And this is also a pretty niche thing in practice, but if you have her at C6, you can get this extra 150 EM, which is pretty huge. Now this one I think is quite an important category, which is practical application. For starters, as you may have noticed, Raiden's electro application hits at the enemy, which can be pretty good as dendro cores are usually created near enemies, so Raiden can easily hit cores created near these enemies. And as we discussed earlier, Shinobu's electro application is a circle around the player model, which can sometimes be less practical because you might not be in range of the cores. But as some people may have noticed, it can actually sometimes be more practical because, as some people may have noticed, like versus bigger enemies such as the Way Nut or Wee Nut, Raiden targeting that model can make her miss the cores on the floor. Meanwhile, that's not going to be a problem for Shinobu. Another aspect of practical application is that Raiden's skill lasts longer. Meanwhile, Shinobu can have downtime, especially without C2, whereas Raiden's skill, it lasts such a long time, you're quite unlikely to forget to reuse it. However, I do note that a lot of these teams are quick swap, so I don't really think that Raiden's skill potentially lasting longer is that big of an issue, especially as you can easily just switch back to Shinobu to reactivate her skill. And like I said, with C2, you can have 100% uptime on that too. This one is quite big, but because Raiden's electro application requires hits, she can't hit shielded enemies, whereas because Shinobu's is automatic, she can. This is something that can be pretty huge depending on the enemy. So actually, if you combine these two things, that Shinobu can be more consistent versus bigger enemies and she can hit shielded enemies, you can say overall that playing Shinobu in the Abyss can be a lot more consistent. Lastly, on practical application, and I think this one can be pretty noticeable, is that, as I mentioned before, Shinobu's healing is far from perfect, and because of the way her healing works, she loses HP, and this can make her pretty fragile. She will often be at low HP in the Abyss, and if you're not careful, she can get KO'd. So even though she is a healer, it's not quite the same as if she was like Kokomi or having a shield like Zhongli. But at the end of the day, it's pretty decent healing, and it's more than good enough for a lot of people. Now the last category I thought of is accessibility, and these can be quite huge. First of all, the fact that Raiden is a 5-star and Shinobu is a 4-star character. But notably, Shinobu isn't an OG character, she is one of the newer characters, kind of, and a lot of people don't actually have her now. So what I've noticed is that quite a few people, they might have one of these characters and they might not have the other. So ultimately that might be the decider for which character you would play. But obviously, personally, I like to think that given more time and given more people eventually get Shinobu having a lot of these similarities to a 5-star character can only be an advantage for her. Now, having said that, as I mentioned before, she will not have 100% uptime on her elemental skill without her C2. And she does have pretty decent C4s and C6s, although they are far from necessary. This can be a downside to her accessibility, whereas for Raiden in hyperbloom teams, she is completely ready to go at C0. Just to note though, even if you don't have her C2, the downtime isn't huge, and she does have her burst that you can use whilst refreshing skills and bursts on her teammates. 100% uptime can be more of a min-max thing. Now the last point on accessibility is that Shinobu's 4-star weapons are either craftable or from events, so it's pretty easy to get one of these. And then she also has a bunch of gacha alternatives. Whereas with Raiden, we've discussed Dragon's Bane already in this video, and it gives a lot more EM than her alternatives. And unfortunately, that's a gacha weapon, which means it's not guaranteed, and it means that some people might not actually have it. The craftable alternatives don't give that much EM. And this is something that's actually quite a big deal, I think, is that we can't assume everyone has Dragon's Bane. Whereas if somebody has Shinobu, it's quite easy for them to craft Iron Sting and they should be good to go. So that's the video. I think I covered quite a lot of different topics, and a lot of these things can be subjective and can be down to your preference. So like I said, with each category, decide for yourself if Raiden has the advantage there or if Shinobu has the advantage there. And I do ultimately recommend, if you have both of these characters, just to try them both and see which one you prefer. Although ultimately, because Shinobu is a healer and that is vital role compression for the majority of players, and as we've discussed, there isn't really much damage difference at all, I do think overall the majority of players will be better off using Shinobu. Thanks for watching.